I had a chance to apologize to Mesha for the briefness of my introduction, which is not at all, I didn't say this to her, but it is not at all indicative of the, let's see, brief longness of my admiration, which doesn't quite work out. But my admiration is like deep and long and not brief. I read Sugar Run with great pleasure earlier this semester, right after it came out. And let me just start by saying quickly, Mesha's name is Mesha, Maren. And I had a few minutes before just now to ask her about this name, because I want to make sure I pronounced it right, because at first I did not pronounce it correctly. So Mesha, her parents thought she would be a boy. And her mother especially wanted the name of Mesha, short for the Russian Michael, and because she wanted the son to be named after Baryshnikov. As it turned out, Mesha was not a boy, but she is nevertheless, in a way, named after Mikhail Baryshnikov, which I think is really cool. Okay, so Mesha is the author of the novel Sugar Run, which just came out, Algonquin Books, which we know. Her short stories and essays have appeared in Tin House, Oxford American, Crazy Horse, Southern Cultures, Hobart, 40 Stories, new writing from Harper's Perennial, and elsewhere. And notice that I said short stories and essays, okay? So this is somebody who also does creative nonfiction and can teach that. She is the recipient of the 2015 Thomas Wolfe Fiction Prize, 2014 Elizabeth George Foundation Grant, an Appalachian Writing Fellowship from Lincoln Memorial University, and fellowships from the McDowell Colony and the UCross Foundation. She is the 2018-2019 visiting writer at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and also serves as the National Endowment of the Arts Writing Fellow at the Berkeley Federal Correctional Institution. Okay, so there's an interesting range here. Let me just quickly quote from Charles Frazier's review in the New York Times of Sugar Run. Maren is masterly at describing America's modern wastelands, the blasted towns not yet and maybe never to be the beneficiaries of rehabilitation and reoccupation. You can almost see Maren cutting each typed page into 3 strips and requiring each strip to contain something delightful offered to the reader as recompense for a world that presses up against you, all raw and aggressive and dangerous. A language that fully owns its power to capture just that, and this is her phrase, heart-wild magic. Mesha Maren.
Thank you all so much for coming today. It's really a great honor to be here and to have the chance to talk with you a little bit about the relationship between my writing and my teaching. When I was an undergraduate literature student, I read an interview with the author Elizabeth Strout, where she was talking about how after the success of her book, Olive Kittredge, she was going to stop teaching creative writing. And she said she was going to do this because for her, teaching drew from the same well as her creative work. And I was an impressionable young undergrad and a hopeful future author. And I took Strout's words to heart. I thought that that must be true for any serious writer. But as I entered graduate school and continued to develop myself as a writer and started teaching, I realized that what was true for Strout was most certainly not true for me. And to my own delight, I found that teaching breathes new life into my creative work, and in a sense, it actually replenishes that well. And as I said about preparing for this talk today, I wanted to articulate exactly that relationship and what it means to me. And I found that the best way to describe it is to use a term from the Russian theorist Viktor Shklovsky's essay, Art as Technique, where he talks about defamiliarization. Shklovsky's theory is that when we become too familiar with an object or an idea, that we become habituated to it and no longer actually see or experience it. And defamiliarization is the process of removing something from this automatism so that it can once again impart sensation. And this process of making the familiar strange and the strange familiar is of the utmost importance to me in my own fiction and nonfiction writing, but it is also a concept that is integral both to the very way that I go about teaching creative writing and why teaching is so important to me. In short, I find that teaching defamiliarizes the writing process and brings a fresh energy to my creative work. I thought that I would begin by talking about defamiliarization in my own creative writing and reading to you a little bit and discussing that there to give a context before moving on to talk about defamiliarization in my teaching and the relationship there. When I began drafting what would become my novel Sugar Run, I was living in Iowa City, Iowa, and I was missing West Virginia very, very badly. So I grew up on a farm in West Virginia, in southern West Virginia, and while living in Iowa City was not the first time that I had left my home. I traveled in Europe and South America, but somehow in those cold, incredibly cold and snowy streets of Iowa City, I felt like I was missing my home mountains more than I ever had before. And as a result, I began writing about the place that I come from. And I don't know if any of you have ever experienced this, but sometimes for me, when I'm longing for a place, it becomes almost like my own private little movie playing all the time in the back of my mind. But the problem with that sometimes is that it is just that. It is a little bit too private and doesn't open up to the universal in the way that great literature must. It becomes a little too nostalgic or rose-tinted. So I knew that I needed a way to see West Virginia from a new perspective, a way to defamiliarize it, although I was not yet familiar with that term. At the same time, I had been working for a while with a fictional character, Jody McCarty, writing scenes with her. I figured that she would probably become a part of some of the short stories that I was working on at the time. I had not yet tried to write a novel. But the more that I worked with Jody, the more that I saw that she too was missing West Virginia. She'd been gone a long time and was trying to make her way back there. And I realized that Jody was my key to defamiliarizing the place that I came from. Through her, I could write about the landscape and community that I loved, but from a new perspective. And as I drafted the novel, this idea of seeing something familiar in a new way and seeing something through someone else's eyes became integral themes in the very novel itself. Jody went to prison when she was 17, and she spent 18 years behind bars. So she is a character who defamiliarizes everything, because she spent so much time on the inside that when the novel begins with her release from prison, everything is new to her. But she is also trying to return to the familiar, a piece of land in West Virginia that her grandmother Effie left to her. And this farm, which is based off of the farm that I myself grew up on, is at the heart of the novel, and throughout the narrative, Jody shares this place with various important people in her life. Before she goes to prison, she shares it with her girlfriend Paula, and then after she's released, she shares it with her girlfriend Miranda. And through their eyes, she's able to see it in a new way. So I thought I would read to you just briefly a passage that demonstrates the way that Jody sees the land through her grandmother Effie's stories, through her own perspective, and then also through her new girlfriend Paula's perspective. Down below Effie's land, there were 3 linked caves, and Effie had loved to tell Jody stories about them, to tell how her Uncle Sal had wandered down over the cliff one fall, hunting for horse chestnuts. And when a freak storm dropped 3 feet of snow, the pig got stuck, stayed the whole winter down in those caves. Effie and her uncle came out to the cliff every few days, wading through waist-deep snow with a pail of slops. They lowered the bucket over the edge on a long rope and fed the sow that way till spring, when she'd come back up over the ridge with 6 new babies. It was a wonder she wasn't killed because come winter, all the good-sized caves were claimed by bears, Effie said. And Jody had loved to picture that, all the crooks and crannies of the land under her feet, filled with sleeping bears. The Lady Cake Caves, Effie called them, for the formation in the middle of the biggest cavern, a mineral deposit shaped just like a big white cake. The mouth of the cave was shallow, not much more than a shale overhang, but if you followed it back, you'd see it kept going. Lying flat as a dog, you could wriggle through and out into the first chamber. Effie claimed that if you looked closely enough, you could see cave paintings. Jody never did see them, but she loved to hear the stories. Effie told her how the land was precious, older than old, but with every generation, they lost a little of its essence. Even when they were right there in the middle of it, every generation, she said, grew more and more distant until the land itself was nothing but an encumbrance, nothing more than the thing in the way between your trailer and the nearest shopping mall. When Jody first brings Paula up to the caves, they have known each other for only 4 days. Paula doesn't believe Jody, says she must be pulling her leg, telling her they can push through into that split mouth. Jody goes on ahead, burrowing in between the muddy rocks. Paula is hesitant but stubborn too, and though Jody has known her for only 4 days, she can already see how she hates to be left behind. The cold air laps up against Jody, a heavy black darker than the dark behind her, and the air full and wet with shifting and visible proportions. She can feel the space in that circle room adjusting to her, the hole her body makes in that mineral thickness, and it feels safe. The rest of the world out there is far away. Jody? Paula calls, her voice small. Jody stretches her fingers in front of her face, feeling without seeing, eyes frantic at first but soon settling. Come on, she hollers. When Paula tumbles finally into the cavern, she sucks up half the air and Jody feels everything flip, the room loud now with the jumble of both bodies. I've got a lighter here somewhere, Paula says, but Jody silences her. Shh, no, you'll ruin it. You turn on a light now, and our eyes will never adjust. Just us. The rocks whisper. Jody can see without seeing that all of Paula's cocksureness is gone. She is scared, and it tastes to Jody like an ice-cold sweetness. She drinks it in, keeps it there on the back of her tongue. This way, she says, inching forward toward the arch into the next room. Their eyes do adjust, and they quit falling eventually over every bump and start seeing the outlines of the stalagmites under their feet, the long, white drips of icicle rocks, and green lichen glowing on fallen slabs of stone. They leave the second chamber and bend again, bowing to their knees as they make their way into the throne room. The cake sits in the very center, as tall as Jody's waist and perfectly white. Paula's breath sucks in. Stepping up, Jody pulls her close, the warmth of their bare skin tingling against all that wet air, and just above them, in the arched dome of limestone, a small hole lets in 2 pinbeams of light, bright at the surface but bluer below, as they fall and spill across that slick mineral. So I just wanted to give you all a little taste of that, and of how recurring throughout the novel, this idea of a space that is familiar but is seen through new eyes, and the way that the power that Jody feels that she holds in that moment in introducing this space to a new person. In my second novel, Perpetual West, the process of making the familiar strange and the strange familiar comes into play in important ways also. Perpetual West follows 3 characters. Alex, a young man who's born in northern Mexico, but he's adopted by a couple from West Virginia, a missionary couple, so he's raised in West Virginia. And he is entering into a master's program at the University of Texas in El Paso, a sociology master's degree, and so he's going back to the border for the first time as an adult. Along with him is his wife, Alana, and then the third character, Mateo, is a young Mexican wrestler. So Alex is studying Mexican professional wrestling through a sociological lens. So he's interviewing Mateo. And in Perpetual West, the setting of the book there on the US-Mexico border in El Paso, Texas, in Ciudad Juarez, Chihuahua, is an important tool in defamiliarization. Borders are interesting spaces, right, where by their very nature, they do the work of making the strange familiar and the familiar strange. What is common to us on one side is unusual, just a few feet across the border, culturally speaking, and vice versa. So I thought I would read to you just a small selection also from that novel so you can see what I'm doing there with this idea of the border region being a defamiliarized space. This is from the very opening of Perpetual perpetual west. They came by way of the Blue Ridge, crossed the first state line at Kingsport and tracked the whole of Tennessee, Memphis at night in the rain, the Mississippi charging angry under them. Past the bluffs it was floodplains. Arkansas and then nothing but Texas. They came by way of the stay-in motel, Crystal's, Taco John's, and Dixie Cafe. Burger wrappers shifting under their feet, receipts on the floorboard like a poem of their journey. Aquafina, Butterfinger, medium coffee. They came by way of brown grass and thirsty names. Sulphur Springs, Mineral Wells, Sweetwater, Big Spring. They came for their schooling, for his past, her getaway. That first time they saw the border, it was late August, evening, and still hot outside, but the sunlight was changing, thinning and paling a little. It fell through their car windows in long slashes that illuminated the dust on the dashboard, the cracked windshield, an expired inspection sticker, all the little details that the police would eventually note in their report after finding the Honda abandoned in the Candy Club parking lot. But that was still 5 months away. On this August day, the evidence pointed only to the fact that Alana and Alex were too poor to fix the windshield and too distracted to keep the inspection up to date. Behind them, a slope of treeless mountains hunched in shadow, and before them, past the squat concrete bunker of the Paso del Norte border station and the brown gulch of the Rio Grande, Juarez rippled with headlights and neon signs. Alex drove, or rather he sat in the driver's seat and stared at the line of Jeep, Toyota, Chevy, Mitsubishi behind them, and the equally jammed vehicles in front. After days of width by miles, they'd arrived in a funnel. U.S. stagnancy, and to the south, the chaos of Juarez. Alana sat in the passenger seat with a box of Fig Newtons and Wuthering Heights open in her lap. Maybe we should stop and eat before we get to Jorge's, Alex said. Alana's eyes traced the same page, the same few lines over and over again, but the point was not really reading. She'd read Wuthering Heights at least 4 times before. Just grab some tacos and a beer, Alex said. There's not going to be any beer at the mission. Alana found it funny that he should worry about beer. He hadn't drank a single drop of alcohol at all until he turned 21, just 5 months ago. And now, even though he didn't drink much, he seemed to have incorporated it into his new vision of how to be an adult. Adults drank beer at the end of a long day. It didn't seem to matter to him that he and Alana had never done that before the past few months. We should find our way to the mission before it gets dark, Alana said, without looking up. She bit into another Fig Newton, the cookie stuck to the roof of her mouth and mixed in with the smell of gasoline, desert dirt, and dry sunlight. You don't want to stop for one beer, Alex asked. Alana looked at him, holding her finger on the sentence she'd been reading. After 8 hours of driving, he said. She blinked. You're afraid, he said. The cars beside them jerked ahead. Alex lifted his foot off the brake just a little and looked at Alana again as the Honda rolled forward and smacked. Alex yipped and Alana toppled. Her forearm slammed against the glove box as the windshield darkened above her, tumbling with movement. There was a series of dull thuds, and it took her a moment to see what was happening. She squinted and stared through the windshield as the back doors of a maroon van swung on their hinges and box after box of Fruit Loops, Cheez-Its, Hamburger Helper, Chips Ahoy, Honey Nut Cheerios, and finally a case of Pepsi wheeled out and landed on the Honda's windshield and an explosion of dark sugar. Alex hauled up on the emergency brake and leapt out. Alana pushed her door open slowly, watching as a bleach-haired woman emerged from the passenger side of the van. I told you it's not the same, the blonde said, looking back over her shoulder. Alex was pushing groceries away, inspecting the point of impact. No one in the border station up ahead seemed to have noticed, though there was a growing cyclone of noise, horns honking, and voices barking as cars swerved around them. Alana watched the blonde woman light a cigarette. I'm sorry, Alex said as a man came around from the driver's side of the van, paunchy and sunburnt. I should have been paying better attention, Alex said. Shouldn't have been so close to your bumper. He touched the place where the Honda had dented the metal, and suddenly the sunburnt man was moving fast, something in his eyes wet and vulnerable like physical pain. His hand reached into his pocket and came out with a blade. It snapped open and shimmered against his pants leg. Don't touch my van, he said. Alex stuttered backwards, hands out at his sides. Alana lunged and tripped into the open door of the Honda. Chester, the blonde, dropped her cigarette and crushed it. Put that thing away. He turned, knife still out, but his face changing now, loosening. She's the asshole who thought it'd be a great idea to come down here in the first place, he said, his hand trembling as he waved the switchblade at her. Start over fresh, she says, south of the border. She stepped in closer, gripped his wrist and pulled his knife hand down toward the blacktop. And here's the ass who thought we could use our food stamps card down in Mexico. Alana let out her breath and looked to Alex. His eyes said terror, but his lips were curved into an expression she couldn't understand. She looked back to the couple as the man slouched toward the driver's seat and the woman flung a bag of dill pickle potato chips into the open van. Before them, against the pinkening skyline, a white and red and green billboard announced, "Hola amigos, welcome to Juarez." Behind them, the final rays of sunlight struck the glass of the El Paso business district and burnished them in a liquid opalescence. That's just the opening there of that. In my nonfiction writing also, defamiliarization is an important tool. I recently published a piece of long-form journalism in the Oxford American magazine in which one of my goals was to explore the views of LGBTQ youth in West Virginia, their experiences there, and to compare them to my own experiences growing up in Appalachia. And many of the young people that I interviewed had very different and much more positive experiences in the very same county, in the same school district that I myself had attended. And this new perspective transformed the essay and disrupted my original perspective on LGBTQ life in Appalachia in a very fruitful way. And I also find that even when I'm writing strictly personal essays about my own experiences, I find these techniques of defamiliarization to be essential at getting at what Richard Hugo calls the generated subject. So in the packet that I gave for you all today, there's a little quote on the front there where Richard Hugo talks a little bit about the generated subject that you come upon in writing versus the triggering subject. The deeper meaning within the thing you set out to write. I included also in the packet, in the back of the packet for you today, a little essay that I wrote called Among, where I used the form of a dictionary definition to help break away from the familiar tropes of a coming out story. So by examining the word among and the various definitions, I was able to come to the realization that the fear present in the piece is not the generalized fear of being ostracized after coming out, but rather the very specific fear of never being allowed to be emotionally and physically close to the women in my family again. And I found that taking that sort of defamiliarized form was a way for me to get at what I was truly trying to write about. As I mentioned before, defamiliarization is not only important to my fiction and nonfiction writing, but is also essential to the way that I teach. I find that a university class is in many ways the perfect place to engage in the process of defamiliarization because the structure is familiar. Semesters are always the same length. Class periods tend to be a similar length. The way that I set up my classes is usually split between close reading and analyzation and then generating and then workshopping creative work. But the contents of the courses are ever changing. Each new semester brings new students, new opportunities for bringing fresh readings into the syllabus. And I can think of no better way to constantly ask myself to re-engage with the various aspects of my art. The process of writing cannot become stale for me because when I'm teaching, I'm constantly forced to re-examine it, see it through new eyes, to break it down and reevaluate it over and over again. It's my job to take what's familiar to me, this process of writing and editing, and to see it in a strange or new way, that is through the eyes of my undergraduate students. And then to take what is strange for the students, this process of writing and editing, and to make it familiar or at least understandable for them. So in a way, I'm experiencing this defamiliarization even as I teach it, and I find that I stay tuned to the fact that writing creative work is a mystery in many ways, but it is an attainable mystery nonetheless. And no two classes are ever alike, of course, so even if I'm using the same reading materials, the discussions are always varied, and the writing techniques that come easily to one student may be quite difficult for others. So I'm constantly asking myself to see the writing process through each individual student's eyes. And I find that in this process, I must, in the words of Paul Valéry, forget the name of the thing. I must find new language to explain what are to me familiar writing methods. And this process of constant re-examination is also fruitful for my own creative work. Because as I search for new ways to explain ideas such as objective correlative, I think about these processes in new ways, and that brings fresh energy. I can never sit back and feel as if I know everything there is to be known about a certain aspect of the writing process. And when I talk with my students about defamiliarization, I usually begin by talking about Ferdinand de Saussure and his sign signifier signified. And I find that technology is often quite useful for this because students are familiar with the idea, of emoji clearly doesn't carry the same emotional weight as the word that it represents. Neither does the word carry the same emotional weight as the original concept. And I also use for them the example often of a stop sign, where we all know what to do when we see a stop sign. We know to bring our car to a stop. But how often do we actually engage in the larger context? The fact that we have to read that word, bring our car to a stop so that we don't run over a pedestrian or run into another car, right? We just see that red shape and we know what to do without thinking about hardly anything at all. So I tell my students that words like love, hate, sad, mad, these are all stop signs. We all know what they mean, but when we see them, we do not engage deeply. And this is quite related to Victor Shklovsky's idea of algebrization, right? So in the Baxter handout there on page 32, Baxter says algebrization is the process of turning an event or familiar object into an automatic symbol. And Shklovsky says that by this algebraic method of thought, we apprehend objects only as shapes with imprecise extensions. We do not see them in their entirety, but rather recognize them by their main characteristics. We see the object as though it were enveloped in a sack. We know what it is by its configuration, but we see only its silhouette. The object, perceived thus in the manner of prose perception, fades and does not leave even a first impression. And algebrization, of course, is the enemy of good art, because with art, we want people to fully feel. So I tell my students how the word for cliche comes from a word that typesetters working in printing presses used when they were using movable type. A typesetter found a phrase that recurred often enough, right? They would set it into a cliche or stereotype, that is, a solid metal cast, so that they did not have to continue setting it letter by letter each time that they came across this phrase. I tell this to my students to help them see that when we talk about not using cliches, it's because it's actually not your own words. And the reader cannot engage in it fully in a fresh way because they've seen it before, and so we assume that we already understand it. Or as Shklovsky says, it is enveloped in a sack of familiarity. By explaining this to the students, I ask myself also to once again re-engage and look with new eyes on my own work and to rout out all possible cliches. Students will often ask me, they'll say, okay, I understand what you're saying about cliches, but then how? How do we avoid this inedible peach of received ideas, as Baxter says that Flaubert thought of it? So I break the process of defamiliarization down into four sort of general categories. We talk first about point of view, how you can write about a familiar place or even a familiar subject from a new point of view, as I did in Sugar Run, looking back at my own homeland, or in Tolstoy's Customer, using the point of view of a horse, Virginia Woolf taking on the point of view of a house and time passes, or something like using second person or plural first person. Justin Torres in his book We the Animals uses plural first person. You could also use landscape or setting and let the place do the work of unsettling the reader, as in Paul Bowles' A Distant Episode or Jean Rice's Wide Sargasso Sea. Another option would be structure, to alter the form, such as in the dictionary definition piece, or maybe an epistolary short story, or something written, there are pieces written in the form of a legal contract, or erasure texts do this also, or there's a novel, Yuri Herrera, Mexican novelist, Signs Preceding the End of the World, where he takes the structure of an Aztec myth of the afterworld and applies it to a modern novel. And then, of course, last but most certainly not least, language, using fresh vocabulary or manipulating language in new and interesting ways. There are countless other ways that you could go about this, of course, but we begin there and then delve into a series of exercises. One such exercise is called the barn, from John Gardner's book, The Art of Fiction, where students are asked to describe a barn as if it were being seen from the point of view of an old man who's just learned that his son died in war. But they are not to write about the old man, they're simply to describe the barn, and they are not to use the word son war, or death. Students often grumble at first. How can I do that? How can I put those emotions into it if I'm not using those words? But the results are always very interesting to me, how they manage to imbue their descriptions of the barn with emotion, all the while avoiding these words. And when they complete that, I then ask them to turn around and to describe the same barn, but from the point of view of someone who has just learned that their spouse is going to be coming home safe from the war. And the descriptions that the students come up with are something akin to Gerard Manley Hopkins' widowed image, where the burden of feeling is taken on by the object, in this case a barn. Another exercise that I love to use is to ask students to volunteer subjects or characters that they would like to write about. So I've gotten everything from can-can dancers to bank robbers, to Martian colonies, civil rights marches, whatever it might be. We put the words up on the board. Communally, we write down underneath them all of the associations that we have. And then individually, I ask the students to choose one to write about that subject or character without using any of the words that we put onto the board. And this exercise can be paired with a reading from Flaubert's Dictionary of Received Ideas, where he satirically collated all the familiar cliches associated with certain words. I also really like to introduce students to the work of the Oulipo writers. I understand that a member of the Oulipo group, Angaretta, teaches here, which is exciting. The Oulipo, or Workshop of Potential Literature, is a group of French writers and mathematicians who, in the words of Georges Perec, set rules in order to be totally free. They write prose and poetry based on specific constraints, such as the lipogram, leaving a certain letter of the alphabet out, as in Perec's novel Avoid, a novel about the missing letter E that's written entirely without using any words that contain the letter E. Or other Olympian constraints would be n+7, replacing each noun in a text with a word that falls 7 words forward in the dictionary. Or Raymond Queneau's exercises in style, where he rewrote the same brief scene over and over, 99 times in 99 different ways, wrote it backwards, wrote it entirely in metaphors. Or Angaretta's novel Sphinx, in which neither the gender of the narrator nor the narrator's lover is ever revealed. When I introduce students to these methods, sometimes they're baffled, or sometimes they see the results as just being silly. But what I really love about asking them to engage in these exercises is that they are forced to write in new ways, forced to avoid their regular modes of writing. And therefore, their writing automatically becomes defamiliarized, and they are able to achieve what Shklovsky says is one of the greatest goals of art, that is, to increase the difficulty and length of perception, because the process of perception is an aesthetic end in itself and must be prolonged. So while many of my students go on to write fairly traditional short stories and essays in my class, I find that asking them to experiment during the drafting process and during the revision process is a way to bring a fresh perspective, fresh language, and to help remove what Baxter calls the tyranny of meaning over event. And as I talk with my students each semester about avoiding cliche algebrization, and I push them to dig ever more deeply into new ways to convey what it is that they're truly trying to express, I find that at the same time I am examining my own impulses, my own familiarities, looking at my own work and seeing how I might further defamiliarize my own creative process, but also my process of teaching. And whether my students go on to become published authors or more than likely choose another field, I still firmly believe that these techniques will continue to help them to articulate precisely what it is that they mean to communicate with both power and grace. I brought a couple of texts that I like to use here in case anybody's interested, and I also would love to engage in questions, conversation.